You are now tuned into the Hip Hop Learners Podcast, a place for conversations on hip hop literature, both scholarly as well as general audiences. Today's guest is none other than Niel Scobie. As a core member of the early Vancouver hip hop community, Scobie was largely responsible for bringing hip hop to the airwaves in the west coast of Canada. As a scholar, Scobie has dedicated years to understanding and documenting early Toronto hip hop. From his master's thesis on Michie Mee called Jamaican Funk Canadian Style, Diasporic Dialogues, and Hybridized Identity in the Music of Michie Mee, to recent articles on early Canadian hip hop pioneers like Jay McGee and his current doctoral research on the city's first decade of hip hop history. In this podcast, we speak on all of the above with a focus on the master's thesis on Michie Mee. That said, please welcome to the show, Niel Scobie. First off, man, I said this at the beginning of the call here, but I can't thank you enough for taking the time out to speak to me here today. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. So there's going to be a fair amount of people inevitably that are listening to this podcast who simply have no idea who Michie Mee is. Are you able to give a brief overview of who Michie Mee was and the role that she ended up playing in the Toronto hip-hop scene? I know it's a lot to ask, but just kind of briefly.
Well, sure. If I got to correct that, I would say she was in the Toronto hip-hop. She's still active to this day. But I think most importantly, she was one of the first artists in Canada to really make a name for herself, both locally and abroad. Remember, in the mid-'80s, when she was getting started, hip-hop and rap music was still very much an underground phenomenon. Except for, say, Run DMC's Walk the Stay, Salt and Pepper's Push It, there wasn't a whole lot of rap on commercial radio. Right? So it was still very much an underground phenomenon. And she came along at this time and excuse me, and made her name first as a battle rapper. Most notably, there was a battle that she entered in Toronto in March of 1987. It was part of Ron Nelson's New York Invades TO series.
New York versus Toronto kind of thing, right?
Yeah. He would advertise. Basically, he would invite New York acts to come to Toronto to perform, but he would advertise it as a battle, right? He kind of, I guess maybe it was an advertising ploy that would perhaps bring more people to see, because it's a battle. It's not just a concert, it's a battle. Plus you have local acts. So, if you're somebody in the crowd that is going to watch, you have a vested interest in perhaps seeing your, local brethren win, and defend the city's honor and so forth.
Yeah.
And Michie Mee, she battled a rapper from Brooklyn. Her name was Sugar Love, and she, midway through the battle, she broke into patois, and the crowd went nuts. And this is significant because it really was one of the first times that put Michie Mee on the local radar, right?
Yeah.
But it's also significant because she's one of the first artists anywhere to infuse sort of a reggae, dancehall reggae sonic signifiers into her music, both with patois and reggae style beats. At a time, again, when this was not really a thing. You had Boogie Down Productions doing it a little bit. You had artists like Shinehead. In London, England, you had Ashley D and Daddy Freddie. But, reggae rap, that sort of, that hybrid was not really a style that was popular, not until the 90s. Like artists like Supercat. I think one of Biggie's first records was on a Supercat record. You had KRS performing with Shabba Ranks, and then later you had Shaggy and Sean Paul became superstars, and they were dancehall reggae artists.
Sure.
So in the 80s, a 17-year-old girl from Toronto, being a noted and fierce battle rapper that was also producing records with BDP, who was the hottest group at the time, one of them anyway.
Yeah.
And picture it today. Can you try to picture a 17-year-old girl, 16, 17-year-old girl making records with whoever the hottest artists are out of New York right now, right?
Yeah.
And they're from Toronto, and they're also doing it in a style that's kind of new. at the time, you know, she broke a lot of ground in that way.
Yeah,
And
I
then
listened to those
on
early
top of
Michie Mee
that,
records where like KRS will introduce the cut, and and I know you talk about it in the paper as well, but the the impact I think that would have, and I come from a later generation. I definitely didn't grow up in this period of time. I wasn't aware of these records, but I think the impact that sort of sponsorship or cosign would have had, I think is immense. Like, yeah, as you said, BDP and KRS are not only some of the hottest rappers in New York, but they're well respected in like the hip hop community. They're not just selling records and hot rappers, but they're very well respected in the hip hop community. And that cosign is so loud and clear on the first few kind of seconds of that Michie Mee record.
yeah, absolutely. And so going back to the original question about, you know, who she is as an artist, I got to also mention that she has great longevity in the game. You know, she's still recording to this day. She just released an album last year, Revenge of the Yad Gal, I think it's called. And but in that time, in that 35 year time frame, she recorded numerous albums. She's done television. She also experimented with Ragadeth, sort of a rock hybrid band. She performed and toured with for many years in the 90s, and another band too, One Day After. So, I mean, she's sort of like a Renaissance woman in a sense. You know, she's done radio and recording and acting, and I mean, she's done it all, and she's prolific and continues to this day. So, I guess in a nutshell, that's why people should be aware of her at the very least.
Yeah, it's fascinating. One of the things that you just mentioned there that I had no idea, and I'm studying Canadian hip hop myself, and I consider myself fairly well versed in the scene at this point. But you mentioned Reggae and I had no idea that band existed or that Michie Mee had kind of an involvement there. And yeah, as I was reading through the paper, I would go back and I would listen to a lot of these records that you were talking about, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily the sound that I would gravitate to the most, but it's really interesting to see her kind of in that kind of sonic palette, something that I never thought that I would hear Michie Mee kind of be in. But yeah, it's interesting just how diverse of a career she's had. And that was something I had no idea. I knew the early records that she did with LA Love, and I knew some of the records that came out afterwards, but I had no idea the depth of that diversity.
Yeah, and that's another thing that she should be. It wasn't really new. You know, the productions of Rick Rubin and Larry Smith did with Run DMC and the Beastie Boys in the 80s was, you know, somewhat of a rock rap hybrid. But, you know, bands that came later in the late 90s and early 2000s, like Korn and Limp Bizkit and stuff, Ragadeth preceded that, right? And whereas in the 80s, the rock rap hybrid, it wasn't a live band. Like the Beastie Boys, when they were doing like the rock sounding records, No Sleep No Brooklyn and so forth, it wasn't really like a band. They wouldn't perform on stage with a band. It was still very much there was a DJ involved, right?
Yeah, 100%.
But the whole Limp Bizkit thing that came much like later in the 90s, with a band rapping with a band, rap singing, whatever you want to call it, with a band. You know, and it was wildly popular. Well, Ragadeth preceded that, and that's not to say that Ragadeth influenced Korn and Limp Bizkit and that ilk, but you know, I think like years matter when you're writing about music history. Whether it's something came out in '93 or '97 or 2001, it matters. Like I think it matters to get dates right, and it's just a fact that Ragadeth preceded that stuff, and perhaps if they were in the States, they would have, you know, got a lot more traction. But that's not the case.
Yeah. Given the fact that your own background resides mostly in Vancouver's hip hop history, I always find it interesting that you've kind of parked your research in Toronto. I wanted to ask, I guess, why and why specifically cover Michie Mee as kind of a subject for your master's.
Well, when I was doing my undergrad, back in like I went to school late. I was 37 when I went back to school. And I did a media studies degree at Vancouver Island University. And it was about my second or third year when I realized that there was scholarship, academic research on hip hop. I didn't know that was a thing, even though I had read Trisha Rose's Black Noise back in the 90s. But I didn't read it as an academic book. I read it as a book on hip hop, right? It was just,
Yeah.
well, I don't remember what press it was on, but I didn't really think of it as an academic book. It was just a great book on hip hop and hip hop culture and history. And I came across a book, Joseph Schloss's Making Beats, which was all about hip hop sampling. And I read that and I was like, this is a thing? You know, you can write about this sort of thing in a scholarly context. And so that planted the seeds for me to go to grad school. I thought, well, maybe I could contribute to this in some way. But instead of doing something that's already been done, like hip hop sampling or hip hop DJing or whatever, which I was familiar with because that's what I came up doing in the culture, was a DJ and a little bit of producing. I thought, well, maybe I could come from a Canadian angle. And there wasn't a lot, and still isn't. I mean, as you can attest, there's not a lot of Canadian research on Canadian hip hop. It's increasing, definitely over the last few years. But there's a lot still to be covered. So in 2014, I'm doing my master's, and I thought, I remember the discussion I had with my thesis advisor, Jesse Stewart, and I asked him, do you know if there's anything being done on Michie Mee? Now, Michie Mee is important to me because of everything I mentioned 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
But also, when I was a kid growing up on the West Coast, listening to rap music, listening to hip hop, and trying to absorb it as much as possible, she was the first Canadian rapper I had ever heard of. And the fact that she had accomplished all these, all these, I don't want to say firsts, but all these, there were attributes about her that I thought were well worth exploring as an artist. And the fact that, she recorded some of the first rap records in Canada, and then she was co-signed by BDP and was signed to an American label so early in 1988 with First Priority, and then the whole Ragged Up thing. There's so much that she's done, but yet there wasn't anything really significant written on her besides perhaps a few paragraphs here or there. And so that's what led me to write about Michie Mee, because I figured, well, she's an important figure. There doesn't appear to be anything written on her. So, and, third or fourth down the line, I'm a fan, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
I was a fan, so it was an interesting topic that I thought needed to be researched. It reminded me a little bit of when I was a kid and I wanted to do a hip hop radio show in Vancouver because it didn't exist. And I thought, well, why doesn't somebody do it? Why not me? I'll do it. That's a fascinating thing. How about I do a radio show? And then I tried to do it, and I got the show, and Bob's your uncle. And so the same thing kind of applied a few years ago. Is that, well, nobody's really done any research and scholarly work on Michie Mee. So, why not me? So
sure.
Maybe I can do it. Maybe I can contribute to scholarship on Canadian hip hop by doing this. And that's how I kind of got into that lane of like the Toronto lane, even though I'm not from Toronto. And I would say that there's some, now that I'm doing my doctoral research on early Toronto hip hop, which is Michie Mee, but also everything else that was going on in the 80s.
Yeah.
Which I guess we can get into soon enough. Now, I wanted to continue going down that road, doing Toronto, for a couple of reasons. Again, not a whole lot has been written on it. There's a lot of research that's come out. There's a lot of great research that's come out. Mark Campbell, Charity Marsh, my thesis advisor, Jesse Stewart. But a lot of it centers on the 90s and more recent developments in Canadian hip hop.
I think that podcast that Thrust ended up putting together, that Views Before the Six, I think that's one of at least my kind of primary go-to resources for that history.
Yes, absolutely. Can't forget Views Before the Six, Big Trees, and Thrust. that's been monumental too. In fact, I've learned a lot from that podcast.
So have I.
Yeah, and especially particularly with respect to the sound systems. I'll be the first to say big up Goose from the Six for sure. From a scholarly perspective and like things that are published.
Sure.
Not much. And so I thought, well, maybe I can contribute to that. And there's some advantages and disadvantages not being from Toronto. First off, if I were doing the exact same type of research but on Vancouver hip hop, practically everybody that I would need to interview are a phone call or two away, just because I spent so many years in the scene there. Yeah. And so in Toronto, though, that's a little bit harder. You know, in order to try to contact somebody that I want to interview, it might take, you know, several emails and phone calls and tracking them down, and then they don't know who I am and who are you, and I have to explain my research, and, you know, there's a lot of back and forth. Sometimes people don't want to talk to you. Most people will be interviewed. Some people just say no, don't want to. But then I'd say one of the advantages of being from Vancouver and not being from Toronto is that I don't have any horses in the race. I don't have any preconceptions of, or I shouldn't say any. I have very little preconceptions of the Toronto history, because I wasn't part of it. I wasn't living or contributing to it back in the 80s, the time frame that I'm researching. So there's sort of a fresh element as an outsider kind of coming in and observing rather than being part of it like I was in Vancouver. And like, you might not be able to see the forest from the trees where you're in the scene. You know what I mean?
Yeah, throughout the text here, in terms of the masters on Michie Mee, you make this argument, and I think very convincingly, that Michie Mee's story kind of has to be told through the lens of identity and culture. That her cultural mix is so integral to who Michie Mee is that you can't really understand her story without that basic foundation kind of laid out first. In the conclusion, you seem to suggest that other writers covering other artists with similar roots require this lens as well. So for myself, as someone who is writing these stories and will inevitably be writing the story of Michie Mee, albeit in a much smaller capacity, I often wrestle with just how to, I guess, communicate these stories most accurately and most efficiently. Now, I've chosen to leave out identity and cultural backgrounds in the majority of cases and kind of tended to sway towards doing more, I guess, plain narratives of this happened, here's what the person was feeling between those kind of transitions. Do you think a Michie Mee story could be told without this kind of cultural and I guess, backdrop?
Yeah, I think so. I think there are many ways that you can perform the research or tell a story. And from what I understand, you're doing you're conducting a lot of interviews, so it's an oral history.
It's an oral history, correct? Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and so people will choose to talk about what they want to talk about, right? Perhaps some artists want to delve more into, you know, the cultural influences or what have you about their music and or videos or however they express themselves through their art. More than others. With Michie Mee, though, I guess I could have tried to do the research by maybe like just strictly a textual analysis, just doing the lyrics like a historical approach in that sense. You know, this record came out at this time, and this video came out at this time, and then this happened, and this happened. But to me, it's for somebody like Michie Mee, where she presents these different sides, these like a Canadian side and the Jamaican side, and it appeared to be so important to her art that it seemed to be something that I should be looking at. So that's why I kind of took that approach. Now, going back to the beginning of the question, I wouldn't say that it's required to dissect anybody's art in this way, but and I'm by no means you know, alone here. I know Charity Marsh has done work on identity and Aboriginal hip hop in Canada. So, and she's done great work in that regard. So that would be somebody else doing similar work. But there's something about hip hop that kind of lends itself to artists expressing a different cultural sides or different ways of expressing themselves culturally, I suppose.
Sure.
In more so than other genres, at least in Canada anyway. Like, it's very common, and in Toronto in particular, for artists like Michie Mee and MC Rumble from Rumble and Strong, Cardinal Fashala, of course, Dream Warriors, to present right, these different lyrical or sonic signifiers that point to Jamaica or point to Guyana or other countries that they may have familial ties, right? And then on top of that, it's so common in hip hop music to talk about where you're from, right? Murray Foreman has talked about this. He calls it the extreme local, about emphasizing place within one's lyrics.
Yeah.
And most hip hop artists that I listen to, place matters. But I've never really heard Rakim talk about anything other than perhaps Long Island or New York. He does, and maybe that's a personal family history that doesn't go back to the Caribbean just one generation before. Right, a lot of Canadian hip hop artists, especially in Toronto, have ties to the Caribbean, and a lot of artists that were important in Toronto's hip hop scene's development in the '80s were either Jamaican immigrants or children of Jamaican immigrants. So those familial ties are either first or second generation, whereas the history of African Americans is largely different. They have familial ties in the United States that go back several generations, right? We know the history there, right? So perhaps with American artists, you're not going to hear them talk about places other than their city or immediate neighborhoods, whereas Canadian artists may talk about their immediate neighborhood, but also their city, and then the country that they are from or their parents or grandparents are from.
Sure.
There's a lyric, one of my favorite lyrics, and it's 3 words that Michie Mee says. She says it in Bad Yah Bubble. She says, "I'm from Jane." And it's such a potent lyric because she's expressing a Toronto identity, but also a Jamaican identity, because of Jane, short for Jane and Finch, is a neighborhood that has produced a lot of hip hop acts. Dream Warriors are one, but it's also a neighborhood that has a large Jamaican population. So just by saying those 3 words and emphatically saying, "I'm from Jane," motherfuckers know the name. Continue the line. She's stating that she's from Jane and Finch and Toronto, and she's Jamaican, all in one pithy little short sentence. And I think that speaks volumes for what, that sort of encapsulates who she is as an artist, as
Sure.
she articulates this identity of being from Toronto, but also Canadian and also Jamaican. It's all together.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think ultimately when you kind of tell the story in this way, you're much more interested in seeing who Michie Mee is rather than the story of what she did. Was that always, and I guess approaching it from this lens, was that always the way that you kind of approach this topic? Like when you kind of started your thinking about what you were going to do for your master's and you landed on this idea of Michie Mee, was it evident right from the very beginning that this is how you were going to kind of structure it, or did you want to cover it in, I guess, a more traditional way originally?
Well, I don't know if I would say that I was more interested in what she did. It's just that what she did and who she is, they're hard to separate because her identity is so much in the forefront of her art, right? So, like I was saying earlier, I mean, you could try to dissect her artwork as, in a linear sense or maybe in a less sort of cultural analysis sense, but I don't think it would be as rich. I was writing a master's thesis, so if it was just, a couple pages in a book, perhaps it could be done, but I felt the need to really look at, well, why is she wearing both dancehall queen clothing and a hip hop kind of tracksuit in a video? Why is she wearing both? Why in the Bad Gal Bubble video? Why is there a parka with the word Canada emblazoned on the back? That's not an accident, right? But in the same video, she's wearing dancehall queen kind of clothing and going in between rapping and patois, right? These are all very conscious decisions that worth analyzing. It's not an accident that she's doing both and code switching between the just sort of the regular, I don't want to say regular, but the typical Canadian, speaking voice and the patois. She's going back and forth. That for me, before I even started the research, that to me was interesting, and I thought, well, why is this happening? Why is she making an effort to project these different identities? So, what she did and who she is, I don't think that you can really separate the two, and they're really part of the one and the same.
Yeah.
Her identity, and how she chooses to express herself.
Yeah, throughout her life, you can see her identities kind of conflict and complement each other vibrantly throughout her music and her art. You mentioned the music videos and a lot of the fashion statements that she ended up using. The thesis really focuses on two identities, however, and you mentioned them here a few times, but Canadianness in this sense of Jamaicanness. But I wanted to kind of park on the American identity and talk a little bit about that and where it fits in here. You argue in the paper that she's resistant to the American tag, but she's also credited with being kind of an early adopter of hip-hop north of the border, and you state that she takes trips when she's young to the States, and you can see that this clearly had an influence on her. She has a love for American identity and culture, but where does this kind of American identity fit in? Because it really feels like there's three identities taking place, or maybe even four if you count hip-hop identity really being one in there as well.
I don't know if it's so much an American identity and more of an American influence. Yes, she has family that she would visit in New York, and that's where she learned a lot about hip-hop culture back in the 80s and would bring it back to Toronto. But I don't know if that would count as an identity per se. Have you traveled abroad?
To the States, but I haven't traveled internationally.
Yeah.
Or I've traveled internationally, but I haven't traveled overseas to like Europe or Africa or any place really exotic.
Right. When I've been to Europe, and I've been to Brazil as well. My wife is from Sao Paulo. And when I'm talking to people on the street, they automatically assume I'm an American because I speak English and I don't sound like I'm British, right? But I'll be very quick to tell them that I'm not American, and that's not because I dislike America or anything, but I'm very quick to point out that I'm Canadian and that we're not the same. We may speak the same language and there's a lot of cultural similarities, but there's a lot of cultural differences. And I think that may actually manifest in her music as well. I don't want to make assumptions, but I think that's why in the lyric I just mentioned, she says, "I'm from Jane," is to notify listeners that she is from Toronto and she's from Canada and she has a Jamaican lineage. In other records elsewhere, she'll say that she's in clear terms that she's not American. And Meister Fresh West said the same thing in Light Your Backbone Fly. I'm not American, and that's not to slag the U.S. or anything, but it's to make to make a statement that we don't get it twisted. Don't throw us in with the Americans. We are our own culture. We're Canadians, right? So,
sure.
I wouldn't say it's an American identity, but it's definitely an American influence. And what she did, like most hip hop artist was kind of internalize the hip hop influences coming from New York, but adapt them to her immediate surroundings. Right, going back to Murray Foreman and the Extreme Local, how he says that hip hop artists in different cities, take Miami, Houston, LA, London, England, wherever hip hop started to sprout up in the 80s and 90s, artists were definitely influenced by New York and where most of the records were emanating from in the 80s, but then applied it to their local surroundings, right? So, take for example, the whole G-Funk era that came out of LA.
Yeah.
Funk, like Parliament Funkadelic and Zap and Prince and Electro and that sort of thing. They took those influences and put them into the music, and they would talk about driving lowriders, and Ice-T talked about local gang culture. And so it was a way of articulating a local identity, but also being influenced by what was happening in New York. If you listen to NWA's first records, their production was heavily influenced by Bomb Squad, right? But what they were talking about locally, EVE talking about cruising in a 6.4, like that wouldn't have made any sense in New York. Nobody was driving around in a 64 Impala in the Bronx. That was an LA thing. So going back to Michie Mee, I would say that it was an American influence tied into a Canadian and a Jamaican and a Toronto and what you said, a hip hop identity. I think that's accurate, a hip hop identity, because the way that she dressed in her videos, with the door knocker, Roxanne Shante style earrings and the tracksuits, and LA Love in the Jamaican funk video wearing what looks like sort of like a tailored Dapper Dan tracksuit, with his name emblazoned on the front. That was definitely like a New York thing that had been transferred to Toronto, but the whole dance hall style, that was something that was more of like a local and Jamaican flavor coming out in her music.
Gotcha. Early in the thesis, you end up laying out some of the background of the Caribbean diaspora into Toronto and seem to make the argument that although this has clearly been a long process dating back centuries, it didn't really kick into full gear until the 1950s, when particular parties like the NCA encouraged immigration from the West Indies into Canada, and I guess relaxed some of the previous immigration conditions and laws that, I guess, to allow for such immigration to exist. Given the fact that this was such a new community, do you think that this had any role to play into why the Jamaican community in Toronto were so willing to take up hip-hop and blend these personalities? I'm not an expert in diasporic studies at all by any means, but I have read a few texts. But it seems like no one uproots their life to move to a location abroad, say Paris, for example, just to grab McDonald's every day, right? There's almost a tourist-like eagerness to assimilate early on. And I think the more I think about it, the more it makes me think that this probably had something to do with why the reggae sounds kind of permeated Toronto hip-hop so heavily during the early years, and why they were so kind of accustomed to blend these identities with something that is kind of native to the location that they're currently at. Do you think that this has something to do with that? The fact that the NCA and these kind of organizations, and there was a push to, I guess, to have these immigrations be played up heavily throughout the 20th century. So you have this kind of more modern or more kind of new community that's being formed. Do you think that newness had anything to do with why we see that reggae hip hop blend?
Well, Ron Nelson told me something interesting. I back in 2015 when I interviewed him for my master's thesis, he said that the reggae and the hip hop scenes in Toronto have never really been connected. There's actually like a dividing line between the two, and they don't mesh at all. If you're in the reggae world, you're not really in the hip hop world, and vice versa. But I mean, that's not to say that there weren't artists like Michie Mee that adopted some sort of reggae styles. But reggae community is also very quick to say that, and Michie Mee said this in interviews, that she would be referred to by the reggae community as "quote unquote" the rapper, right? Like she wasn't readily adopted by the reggae community because perhaps they didn't maybe at the time they didn't see rap or hip hop as as on their level. I'm not sure. So the articulating the reggae identity signifiers in the music was more of a personal choice. And I also got to say that while there was a conscious effort on her part to articulate these styles, I think it also came very naturally because early in her life, she was exposed to women, both in Jamaica before she moved to Canada, and when she was an elementary school student in Toronto. She was exposed to women like Miss Lou in Jamaica, who had a show on the Jamaican Broadcasting Corporation, the JBC, where she would sing and tell stories in patois. And Michie Mee was actually a member of the audience, a child in the audience, and like think of how much of an influence you'd have as a child when you're on a television show and there's somebody speaking. I mean, I can't speak as a Jamaican person because I'm not, but I mean, as a child, as children, we're sponges and we really soak up these influences. So you take that influence, and then you take the fact that Lillian Allen in Toronto visited Michie Mee's elementary school when she was a child and was doing her poetry in patois. And so these are things that Michie Mee recognizes at a young age that, this is just something that they do that's natural to them, and it's natural to me. So even though there was a conscious effort on her part to articulate this, to make an identity, it also came off as very natural. I mean, she could switch from just a regular conversational English to patois like it was nothing, and there was a certain authenticity to that for listeners. Whereas there was rappers like KRS-One, he did the Jamaican accent at times, but he wasn't born in Jamaica, right? Sure. It was something more inflected to him. Now, there was a part of your question that I didn't understand. The going to Paris, the McDonald's?
Well,
could you?
Okay, so yeah, I can. I hope I can. Clearly, there's a sense of when the Jamaican community in Toronto is relatively young. Let's put it that way. So it made up of, especially in the 80s and 90s, made up of a lot of first generation, second generation Caribbean people. So people that are either born in the Caribbean or their parents were born in the Caribbean. And I feel as though and again, I'm not an expert in diasporic studies. I haven't really done a whole lot of work in this field. I've done some reading here and there. But I feel as though when you travel to a new place, when you're put into a new place, there's a sense of wanting to kind of assimilate and wanting to explore that new culture. Definitely still hold on and not completely assimilate. You still want to hold on to some of your values. You go there with other people and you're put into a Jamaican community in Toronto, and clearly you still identify with being Jamaican. But nevertheless, there's still, I would assume, this kind of desire to latch on to new identities, especially for youth groups of that period. I would think that would have something to do with why they were eager to kind of hop into the hip-hop identity. Now, if what you're saying is the Jamaican community didn't necessarily hop into the hip-hop kind of aesthetic and didn't grab onto that or gravitate towards it, then that changes the conversation a little bit. But when I look at Toronto hip-hop early on, I do see a tie to kind of this reggae hip-hop blend, and it seems fairly pronounced within Toronto hip-hop. Going through your thesis and seeing that this was such a young community, and there was many of the community in the 80s and 90s would have been first and second generation Jamaican. It makes me think that probably had something to do with their eagerness to latch on and kind of blend these identities. Now, again, if that wasn't the case, then it wasn't the case. But I feel like it might be. And I thought it was one of the more interesting kind of thoughts that kind of cultivated when I was reading the thesis anyhow. It wasn't explicitly talked about, but it was an idea that populated anyhow.
I think, okay, I understand the question better now. I think it might be twofold. And one is that in the 80s, the kids that were into hip-hop, they might not necessarily have been into the reggae that their parents were into, right? And hip hop was the latest thing, and it was the hot thing, like from an underground phenomenon, and that's what they were into. But if they were at a hip hop jam, at one of Ron Nelson's battles or whatever, Monster Jams or New York, they'd feel my cat is on. Hang on a sec. Get out of here. Okay, sorry. And so, I mean, if you're a kid and you're, your parents are Jamaican, and but you don't quite listen to Bob Marley or you don't listen to reggae, be that as it may, you might be at one of these Ron Nelson concerts, and Michie Mee's up there battling somebody, and then breaks into patois. I mean, you gotta recognize that and maybe exhibit some sort of local or cultural pride in the notes, even though you don't listen to reggae. The other thing is that, even before hip hop, in the 70s, reggae music was a way for a lot of Jamaicans in the city to connect, right? They had blues dances and basement parties. They would go, a lot of people had sound systems, and so there would be private parties on the weekend, and they would go and listen to reggae, and it was a way of connecting. But I should also be clear that, just because, Jamaican culture is not monolithic. Just because you're from Jamaica doesn't mean that you love reggae. Right? I mean, my dad's family is Scottish, but that doesn't mean I eat haggis and
Sure.
put it that would be, the stereotypical Scottish thing. Michie Mee and artists like her, like Cardinal Fischel, for example, they present a Jamaican side through dancehall reggae, and that's a personal choice. But that doesn't mean that everybody is going to, present the Jamaican identity in that manner, right? I've been to Jamaica, and believe me, not everybody is into dancehall reggae. That is just how Michie Mee presented her Jamaican side, through the dancehall style beats and so forth. I should also mention that perhaps Canada in the 80s and 90s and to the present is a society where people that have moved here from elsewhere, from other countries, feel at more liberty to present. Like Canada is constantly promoting itself as a multicultural society, and that's a society that didn't previously exist in decades earlier in Canada. I mean, for example, my great grandparents came from Iceland, and they worked very hard to try to remove their Icelandic accents because it was all about assimilation. I mean, mind you, this is 100 years ago. And since Trudeau in the 1970s, the whole multicultural act, I think it's a society that really promotes and it's beneficial. I mean, and it's a good thing. I would agree. For new Canadians to hold on to the cultures from countries that they have come from and promote them within greater society. So perhaps Michie Mee and other artists just felt more comfortable and at ease presenting Jamaican side in a society that promoted it.
Yeah, that's fair. I I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to talk about some of your recent work, and specifically the recent editorial piece you ended up doing on Toronto hip hop artist Dr. Jay McGee. In the article, you end up noting that you came across his recordings in the work that you're doing for your doctoral studies. I wanted to ask specifically, how did Dr. Jay McGee's work kind of come up? How did you end up discovering him? And then furthermore, at what point did you realize that there was a story worth exploring? Because okay, a little bit of background here. Again, as somebody that's studying Canadian hip hop, I kind of pay attention to the scene, and I often end up kind of doing research and looking for different names and titles and whatnot, and I subscribe to search updates on sites like eBay for anything Canadian hip-hop related, and I often end up coming across a lot of these almost kind of novelty rap records released by Canadian artists during the 1980s that just go completely unnoticed in the larger scheme of things, but rarely do I kind of see there as being a larger story at play. Usually it's just, there's kind of this novelty Christmas in Hollis kind of rap song that happened in 1982 or whatever. I don't really take the time, I guess, to explore that with much more depth. I wanted to know how you ended up coming across Dr. J's material, but then furthermore, at what point do you start to realize that, wait, there's a story to be told here, and it's an important story to be told here, and we should do that story?
Did you say Dr. Jay McGee?
Wasn't it Dr. Jay McGee? Was he not a doctor afterwards?
No. No, he's not a doctor.
Okay, my apologies.
No worries. I just wanted to be clear.
Yeah, sure.
He's and he's not a hip hop artist either. I mean, and that's what makes the story so interesting, is that he was an R&B and gospel singer, and an extremely talented one. So now, as somebody that did hip hop radio starting in 1989 and was looking for music, Canadian content, somebody that was struggling for Canadian content, I would have loved to have known that these records existed, but I did not. And what's interesting is that even to this day, a lot of people, even in Toronto, don't know about these records, and that there were indeed hip hop records being recorded in Toronto as early as 1979, literally weeks after Rapper's Delight came out. And I first I became familiar with these records about 20 years ago. I bought a record in Vancouver when I was DJing in Vancouver. It was called the Bobby Demo Band, or Rapping with the Bobby Demo Band, or something like that. And you flip it over, and it's an album. And you flip it over, and there's all these information, right, like typical of any album, and it says recorded in Toronto, Kensington Sound, so forth and so forth. And I thought, well, that's unusual. I've never heard of any rap being done in Toronto that early, but anyway, and it's an interesting record. There's anything special about it. It sounds like a typical rap record from the early '80s. It's a live band playing disco style loops that with rapping on top, and that sort of planted the seed. But I didn't really go any further than that. But since moving to Toronto a few years ago, I started more and more discovering these records that said Mr. Q on them. There was a record called Ladies Delight. I thought, well, that's interesting. Ladies Delight sounds like Rapper's Delight. There's a record called DJ Style. There's a record called Party Rap, and they're all on a local record label called Monica's Production, and the artist's name is Mr. Q. And when you listen to the lyrics, it's standard. When you listen to the records, it's standard kind of rap record fare for 1979, 1980. It sounds like Sugar Hill Gang, Curtis Blow, all the copycat records that kind of came out in that era of people trying to jump on the rap trend. You got to remember that at the time, rap was, you got to think of it in context of 1979. I mean, rap wasn't even really its own thing. Hip hop wasn't even really its own established genre. When these records came out, they were largely regarded as just disco records with people talking on top, right?
Sure.
And so these Mr. Q records that came out, when you listen to them, there's nothing in the lyrics that's really specific about Toronto, except one, and that's party rap. And it's late in the record, And Mr. Q starts rapping out Mississauga, and he mentions T.O. And I'm thinking, and when I first heard this for the first time in like 2015, I think, 2016, I thought, these got to be from Toronto. How come this isn't written anywhere? How come, like, nobody seemed to even know about it, right? And in my current research on early 80s hip-hop in Toronto, I have one of my standard questions that I ask people is, what are the earliest examples of hip hop records in Toronto that you remember? And nobody mentions these. And it's because they were poorly distributed, poorly marketed. And I doubt they were even on the radio, and they just kind of came and went. But between the Mr. Q records and a few other records that came out after, that I mentioned Bobby Demo, it's actually two people, Bobby Boyer and Demo Cates. There's probably a good 20 or 25 rap records that were produced by Monica's Production and the label that followed, Scorpio Records, that are early examples of rap records, but recorded and produced in Toronto, which is amazing. And what's interesting to me is that they seem to be, even though they were recorded very early, there seems to be like a great disconnect between them and Toronto's hip hop scene. And even though that they are early examples of rap records in Canada and Toronto, they're not nearly as important as the work that came later, Michie Mee and Meister Fresh West and everyone else. But the simple fact that these records exist is a story. So by just doing a lot of, sleuthing around online and cold calling people and trying to find out who Mr. Q was, I found out that it was a guy named Jay McGee living in Flint, Michigan, who was also a singer. And I called a few of the names that were on that first record I mentioned, the Bobby Demo record, and I talked to an engineer named Dan Durbin, and he directed me to Vazy Tayeb, who owns Kensington Sound. And Kensington Sound is a recording studio that a lot of these records were recorded at, and it's still active today. I interviewed Vazy and played him some of these records, and he was like, I don't remember any of these, but we must have done them because it says Kensington Sound right on the jacket. And I told him that I was trying to find out the identity of Mr. Q, and I think it was Jay McGee. And he said, I know Jay McGee. We're friends on Facebook. We're still friends. And he gave McGee my phone number, and lo and behold, in 2017, McGee called me.
Wow. And
said, yeah, you heard that you're interested in knowing more about Mr. Q and all that. And I'm like, yes. Are you Mr. Q? He goes, yes. My mind was blown, Alex. I'm telling you. Like, it was just like, you're Mr. Q. You're the one that's rapping about T.O. on Party Rap. He goes, yeah. And then we ended up doing an interview about a week later, like a proper interview, and for about an hour. And he explained to me, and it's all in that article I wrote, and he explained to me that, well, yeah, I mean, it was just a thing on the side. I was a singer, right? So that's why the records don't say Jay McGee. They say Mr. Q, because I was trying to formulate a career as a singer. And so, when George Lewis, the owner of the record label, he and Monica, this is like Monica, they own Monica's Cosmetics. The store is still there. The record label's dead, though. It's been dead for 35 years. George asked him to rap on some records, and he was like, yeah, sure, I can rap, no problem. And that's how those records came to be. But they didn't make any sort of noise, like, anywhere. In fact, if you go on Discogs to buy some, almost all of them are located up in Europe for some reason. So a lot of them made their way over there. I'm not sure why, but that's where they went. And here's a key thing that I got to mention too. None of the dates on the records, there's no dates on the records as far as the Mr. Q records, but his very first record, Ladies Delight, I pinpointed to 1979 because I found a review of the record in an English magazine called Record Mirror, and there was a disco column that the author had reviewed Ladies Delight in November of 1979. The same column reviewed Rapper's Delight in September of 79. So think of that time frame there.
Yeah, in order to press a record, get it overseas, because you said it
right.
was an English publication that published it, right? The Review?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So,
record the music as a response to Rapper's Delight, press it up on a reasonable format, which would have been vinyl at that period of time, ship it overseas, have people listen to it, and then have people take notice enough in order to actually write a review for it within a couple-month period. That's mind-boggling.
it is.
Especially at such an independent scale. Like, if a Blondie or something were to do something similar, then of course people are going to be talking about it overseas, but this is a super indie, obscure record.
Right, and that's why it's such a fascinating story to me, because it's a record label housed in a beauty salon run by a Jamaican-Canadian couple, George and Monica Lewis. George also had a record label and sold records out of the basement. He had an idea to record a rap record. I guess he had heard Rapper's Delight somewhere, somehow, whether it was on a local radio station or a Buffalo radio station or maybe at a club in Toronto. Rounded up some local musicians, recorded the song, and then asked Jay to come in and rap on it, and then press it up and send it to England in time for it to be reviewed in the November 1979 article. I mean, it's the whole story is fascinating to me. And then to this day, these records aren't very well known. It's like it's really an amazing story. It really is, and that's why it was worth investigating. And take me, I've been investigating the whole Monica's production and Scorpio Records story for years now, and I didn't just find that information about it being released in November '79. Right away. That took a lot of scouring British music magazines to locate it. And not only that, there are many reviews. The author of that column, he reviewed a lot of stuff that came out of Monica. So George Lewis must have been sending him stuff on a regular basis. I should also say that the records also made their way down in New York, because I interviewed a gentleman by the name of George Steed, who was a drummer, and he drummed on a lot of these records. And he said that he would sometimes accompany George to New York, just for the fun of it, while George would go to different distribution outlets in New York to sell his records. It's a fascinating story there, and I'll tell you, there's a lot more to be told, but I've tried a couple times to interview the Lewis family, and they don't want to be interviewed. So there's so much more that I wish I could tell you, but to get their personal recollection of the story would be fantastic. But I wasn't able to do it. Maybe somebody else can. But when I first approached Monica about it, she just wasn't interested. And I'm not the only one, because there was a reggae documentary that came out a couple of years ago called Shewa Records. And it's about a record that came out on Monica's record, the reggae record. And a local filmmaker was trying to find the name of the artist, because it was all very vague. And he went in to Monica's to try to get the information, and he was promptly, told to go away.
Yeah, decline the interview.
But some people just don't want to talk, and that's their prerogative. Not everybody wants to talk about the past.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. You mentioned earlier this idea of a disconnect between a lot of these artists that were kind of making these, you can call them novelty rap records, but maybe that's inflammatory or deflammatory to a certain degree. But these kind of obscure rap singles that were coming out in the early 80s before artists like Maestro and Michie Mee really took center stage. And there's this kind of disconnect between that community and the hip-hop community that comes a little bit later. I wanted to ask about that and ask if you could expand on that. Do you think it was just because these people like Jay McGee didn't necessarily identify as being hip-hop and having that hip-hop identity? Rather, in Jay's case, he identified being a singer. Do you think that had something to do with that disconnect between these artists and, I guess, the Toronto hip-hop community and hip-hop scene?
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, perhaps if McGee was trying to make it as a rapper, as a hip-hop artist, and then perhaps, I mean, there was no infrastructure for a hip hop scene in Toronto at the time. In fact, you know, a lot of black music at the time in the late 70s and early 80s was thrown under like the disco umbrella or the funk umbrella. There wasn't really a whole lot of separation as far as like, is this a hip hop record? Is it a funk record? Is it a disco record? It was just a record basically.
Yeah.
And you know, even Ron Nelson, when he first started his show, Fantastic Voyage, it wasn't a hip hop show per se. He played hip hop, but he also played a lot of funk. That's why it's called Fantastic Voyage. That's the name of a song by Lakeside. And the whole sort of hip hop thing came a little bit later when the genre started to kind of emerge as more of like a separate from other genres. The other thing I should mention is that the Toronto hip hop scene, it emerged more so through the efforts of people like Ron Nelson and the sound systems, the DJ sound systems, and artists like Michie Mee and Rumble and Strong and Dream Warriors, that they fashioned themselves as hip hop artists. And Ron Nelson had and Fantastic Voyage became an exclusive hip hop radio show, and he put on hip hop concerts. The genre began to emerge because of their efforts. And at a time when the Mr. T records came out, there was, I don't think George Lewis, the record producer, or Jay McGee or any other artists that were producing those records, they weren't aspiring to be hip hop artists. They were just making records to make a buck. And I don't want that to sound crass or anything, but it's a check. And if somebody asks you hey, do you want to rap on this record? It's like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. I mean, that's how Sugar Hill Gang started. Right? They were approached by a record producer that said, we want you to rap on this track. And only 2 out of the 3 members were actual rappers. So that's I think Dan Charnas probably talked about this in his interview, where it's the culture isn't as pure, a pure kind of under grassroots form as we sometimes like to think it is. There's always monetary elements to it, right? There's always like a money is lurking beneath somewhere in most ventures. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's what these early Mr. Key records were. I mean, it was George Lewis was like, oh, this is the latest thing. Let's hop on it.
Sure. Lastly, before I end up getting you to go, I know that your current work lies in documenting the early years of the Toronto hip-hop scene, and I know we kind of briefly touched on it throughout the conversation here, but because the work hasn't been published, I at least haven't gotten a chance to read it yet, but are you able to divulge a little bit about kind of what you're doing in this work?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So my research centers on the emergence of Toronto's hip-hop scene in the 80s, and also trying to locate the earliest examples of hip-hop culture in Toronto. And over about the last 5 years or so, it's really started to coalesce, and I have 4 main chapters that cover 4 different areas of the scene and its emergence. One is what we just talked about, those early hip-hop records. Now, I did Mr. Q and Monica's production, Jay McGee, and so forth. Now, even though there was a somewhat sort of a disconnect between their records and what emerged later, those records still existed, right? They were still there. That's a fact. These records. So there must have been something kind of bubbling in order for those records to happen. It's also an interesting story because it's to me, it's like sort of an ultimate Canadian story. A Jamaican Canadian record producer has a record store in a beauty shop. He hires a guy from Flint, Michigan, who's a singer, to rap on a record by a bunch of local Canadian musicians producing the record, and then he puts it out. And it's a uniquely Canadian story, I think. That's one chapter. And then another chapter I have on the sound systems that were so prolific in Toronto in the 1980s. Sound systems like Sunshine Sound, Kilowatt, Doc Sound, there's several more that are escaping me. Chic Dynasty, can't forget Chic Dynasty. These are mobile DJ groups that would tour around the city and perform at high schools, community centers, and so forth. They would do outside sort of block parties. And these DJ groups, they provided a lot of the first opportunities for local MCs to rap. Case in point, Michie Mee and Sunshine Sound. So some of, like, before she was even like a noted battle rapper, she got some live experience from performing at the Sunshine Sound parties. That's another chapter. Okay. Of course, I can't forget Ron Nelson. There's an entire chapter on Ron Nelson and his efforts as a radio DJ and as a promoter. He's extremely important to the scene. And then lastly is the sort of the commercial breakthrough, so to speak, in the late 80s with artists like Maestro Fresh West, Michie Mee, Dream Warriors, and so forth. And Maestro, I mean, I've been talking a lot about Michie Mee, but Maestro is extremely important as well, because he, with the help of local media like Much Music, helped really spread hip hop from coast to coast. Like a couple years later, like Hammer and Vanilla Ice, they really kind of attracted like a wider audience to hip hop. But even before that, in Canada, Maestro Fresh West really broke open a lot of doors. I mean, as a kid that was listening to hip hop in high school, I was like one of a handful of kids. After Let Your Backbone Slide came out, then everybody was listening to hip hop. Maestro Fresh West was that important as far as exposing hip hop culture to a wider audience in Canada. So those are sort
I can
of
attest
the
to that
four,
as well.
Yeah.
Like, even throughout my own interviews that I do within the hip hop community, and I guess this isn't so much in terms of the general audience, wider audience, but within the hip hop community, and I guess it kind of is, because a lot of people that I speak to that kind of grew up in the early 90s, late 80s, a lot of times their first introduction to hip-hop culture, because that's always a question that I ask during my interviews, a lot of times it ends up being Maestro Fresh West. He's a figure that brought a lot of people into hip-hop culture in a pretty meaningful way, and in a sincere way, whereas I think there's a lot of people that were brought in through acts like MC Hammer, for example, or Vanilla Ice, that maybe had a passing interest in hip-hop. And maybe that was the case, too, for a lot of people with Maestro Fresh West. And albeit the people that I speak to naturally actually had a more dedicated passion for hip-hop, just because that's why I'm interviewing them. But I do find that the people that were listening to Maestro, they really ended up latching onto hip-hop in a really meaningful way, and at least in the cases that I speak to, they obviously wanted to do something with that passion.
Yeah, and a lot of hip hop fans come to hip hop through commercial. I wouldn't call I wouldn't call myself a commercial artist, but Let Your Backbone Slide was definitely a commercial success. I mean, how many people were introduced to hip hop through Rappers Delight? I mean, I was in 1986. I heard Run DMC Walk This Way, and then changed my life forever. I mean, I was already sort of familiar with hip hop, but that record and Raising Hell, and then the album, and then License to Ill, Beastie Boys, those two albums. I mean, that just sort of changed. That's not an overstatement. That changed my life. I mean, I'm now in my late 40s, and I'm still DJing, and I'm researching hip hop as a job. So I mean, like you said, I mean, a lot of people were introduced through hip hop through commercial means, but a lot of people maybe even left, right? They might have, that Hammer, that's a great record, or even, records today, the kid might be introduced to hip hop through, I don't know, Post Malone or something, and then go, I'm not really interested in this anymore. But there might be other people that are introduced by a Post Malone or Megan Thee Stallion or whatever, and then start digging into it, and it's like, oh, there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's so much more to it than just this artist. So, there's something to be said about, commercial recordings or commercial successes introducing people to a genre, but then, and then some leave, they stick around, and then other people realize that, oh, there's so much more to this.
This book that you're producing, are you aiming it towards an academic press or something more for general audiences?
Well, it's a PhD dissertation. So
okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So it would first I got to finish the dissertation, and then down the road I would like to turn it into a book. And I think as somebody that wants to be in academia full time and continue doing scholarly research, I think we'd probably be apt to try try to get it on a academic publisher, a university press. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't want to also write a book or perhaps more articles like I did on Mr. Q through non-academic means. I think it's really important for academia to do their best to publish for a general audience. Because if you're just publishing for other academics, I think you're really doing the research a disservice. If you write in an overly flowery academic style, I think you're doing the research a disservice. I think it's best for it to be available to everybody and anybody that would be interested in the topic. You don't want to scare people away by talking about, you mentioned Derrida on the back flap or something. This is a Marxian analysis of yada yada. It's like, okay, do that as it may, you might want to keep that to the inside and not the back flap to attract, just the regular reader in Starbucks or in Indigo looking for something to read.
I totally agree. I think about this aspect or this kind of conversation a lot in terms of my own work and how I want my own work to kind of live. I'm clearly indebted to the hip-hop community here in Canada. Anytime I end up doing an interview, I'm taking somebody's time and they're volunteering their time in order to speak to me, and I have a responsibility to them in order to tell their story. And I think furthermore, I have a responsibility to tell their story in a way that's most accessible to the general audience. So yeah, that means a general audience book over an academic book in a lot of cases, but I think even more so, I've had the conversation of, well, is even a general audience book, is that really the right home for this information in this story to stay? I want to do it because I like writing and I want to produce a book, and I've wanted to for some time, so I'm going to do it anyways. But is that really the be-all, end-all of this project? Do I make an audiobook to make it more accessible? Do I make a documentary? Because I think a lot of people within, I understand the hip-hop community in Canada, they've all went on, they've done their own things, but I still think in a lot of cases, there's a lot of people in this community that aren't necessarily going to end up picking up a 500-page book on their bedside table and read it. Maybe a documentary ends up being the better home for it, right? I'm not sure really where the place is, but I do know that there must be an effort to make it accessible, and to think critically of who your audience is going to be, and if that audience is really going to end up servicing the community that you want to service the best way. I just ended up writing a thesis for my university as well on the Victoria hip-hop scene, Vancouver Island hip-hop scene more broadly, including Nanaimo and Gabriel Island and Victoria, and I did that for the same kind of purposes as you. I think it's something that is kind of missing. I don't think that story's really been told before. And going through, I enjoy reading scholarly writing. I think a lot of the ideas are interesting and worth talking about. But also, I'm in university, so I have to end up doing something, and that's the reason why I ended up doing it. But yeah, I definitely, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that being the be-all, end-all of that research without producing something more tangible, more accessible for the community that I want to end up serving. Yeah, I hope that's clear, but yeah, I think about this a lot.
I agree. I think the writing should be as accessible as possible, and if it's written in a way that is really just for other academics, then you're going to limit how many people read it, and like you said, you'll be doing a disservice to the people that you interviewed, because I'm sure they would, if they're willing to tell their story to you, I'm sure that they would want more people to hear it than less, right? And just
yeah, if they're telling me their story, then they're telling me for a reason. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that.
I'm really excited for the new work. And for those listening, if you haven't taken the time out to check out the previous work that Scobie's done, definitely take your time out and do so. I think it's all really thought provoking and engaging, and I've enjoyed reading the material that you've published so far. But this early Toronto report seems fascinating. You mentioned a few names earlier, people like Mark Campbell, for example, Charity Marsh. These people have done studies on Canadian hip hop more broadly. The We Still Here collection that came out, and we interviewed both. I interviewed both Mark Campbell and Charity Marsh on the collection, but it's doesn't necessarily have that foundational history text of, well, what just happened in this community, and let's get the foundations painted first. And it sounds like that's kind of what you're doing in terms of the early Toronto hip hop scene, and I'm really excited for that to be a thing. I like Everything Remains Raw, the photo collection that Mark Campbell ended up putting out as well. And that's a fascinating piece, but there's clearly more detail that needs to be told there, and it sounds to me like you're getting at that detail. I'm super stoked for the project.
Cool, and I appreciate that. And by no means is it meant to be like a definitive story or anything, but it's just because that'd be difficult to do, perhaps impossible. But it's just I just want to contribute, and hopefully I can contribute to the broader picture of Canadian hip hop history by providing some details of the early scene in Toronto. That's the goal.
I love it. I can't wait for it to come out, and I'll definitely end up reading it when it does. I'd love to have you back on the podcast whenever it does come out and I get a chance to read it, just so we can go over some of the kind of nitty-gritty details with more depth, and I'm sure I'd be able to kind of hold a conversation for an hour or so on the work. So I'd love to have you back on whenever that does end up coming out.
That'd be great. Of course, Alex. Anytime.
Perfect. Once again, thank you so much for coming on. We'll definitely end up staying in touch. But yeah, thank you, and have yourself a wonderful day.
Thanks, Alex. You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right.